On this episode of the LGR Podcast, the 100 Days series asks, is West Surrey being set up to fail?
Hi, welcome back to the LGR series podcast. This week, I'm joined by Councillor Paul Follows, who is the leader of Waverley Council and leader of the Liberal Democrats in Surrey. So I would argue the most senior Liberal Democrat in the county. Now, full disclosure, Paul and I were at university together, but that means I know he can answer some tough questions, which I'm going to do. So welcome. Thanks for coming, Paul.
Thanks, Ryan. Good to see you again.
So you have a really unique and interesting insight into how this is all going, because not only, obviously, you're in the first county under this wave to be being reorganised, but you're also part of the joint committee that's setting up the foundations of this new council. But you also supported a three-tiered unitary model, which was supported in the consultation run by the government. 2 tiers were eventually chosen. So overall, how do you think it's all going with that context in mind?
I should probably just start off by saying I'm not actually against the idea of unitarisation and devolution. I think there's a lot to be gained from this process. What I'm concerned about is how that process was managed, how little the interaction with residents, with voters, the electorate was during this process, and the fact that it is obviously very, very rushed. I mean, there are some advantages for Surrey being first, but actually there are some significant disadvantages too. I think it's also just worth remembering that Surrey has some very unique characteristics, in particular the debt profile, particularly with Woking, but also others. There's likely to be about £4.1 billion worth of debt on this side of what we currently call Surrey versus about 800 million on the east side. And that disproportionate level of debt, I think, is going to be an issue that is wider than LGR as a whole.
Yeah, and how do you deal with that? You can raise council tax and, what's the fairness of that for residents in boroughs like yours that don't have that level of debt? I mean, essentially, it's sharing. You can share the profits, but you also share the losses, and that's what's going on here.
I mean, absolutely. I mean, you don't normally get a lot of very nuanced local government debate happening on the doorstep or walking through the town centre in Godalming, for example. But I will get people coming up to me and saying how appalled they are that a solvent, well-run borough, no debts, like Waverley, is being, forcibly merged with Woking and others. And so it's a concern that has permeated down to, I don't mean it in a horrendous way, but normal people who don't do this sort of work for a living, who realise the impact that it is likely to have. And that is going to be significant because it will impact on services that they see. Discretionary spend in Waverley has been kept at sort of normal levels despite austerity and despite local government cuts. What will happen here is not just potential for council tax rises, which the government, I think, assume at this point will be done at whatever the referendum level is, regardless of what happens. They will see discretionary spend decrease relative to what they've been used to in the past. And in many respects, it is unfair.
Yeah, no, I understand where you're coming from, especially, I suppose, East Surrey not having to have that burden. I mean, one of the questions would be why Elmbridge was merged with the East Surrey side rather than the West Surrey side, being the richest or one of the richest boroughs in the county. Surely it would have made more sense to adopt, therefore, a 3 unitary system and merge, Woking and Elmbridge together. They are, after all, share a territory and planning environment, I would argue, that are more similar. I'm sure Elmbridge wouldn't see it like that, and I would not have backed that kind of view as a former Elmbridge councillor, but practically speaking, that makes more sense.
I mean, the argument we made with the 3 unitary model, I mean, none of us in the South particularly wanted to do this as fast as it's being done here. So we put forward a position despite that, because it's our duty to do so, do it properly, I think. And what we thought about was the place that we're in. And there's a lot of shared features between the south of the county versus the north. There's a lot of shared transport links. Most people who live in those southern boroughs either work there or London. And that's the same for the east and the same for the north. And we thought that would have been also a more equitable distribution of the debt that we obviously all know exists. No one unitary would have by far and away the biggest debt profile. And so what we've been left with, this east and west structure, I am very concerned about the financial sustainability, going beyond whether it's fair or right for those residents who live in solvent boroughs that don't have these kind of debts, because I don't believe that is fair. But let's go beyond that. Is it going to be a financially sustainable model, and what can we do? My concern is that without significant further intervention from the government, and don't get me wrong, a £500 million intervention in Woking's debt is simultaneously the largest intervention in local government debt we have ever seen in this country, but also not nearly enough. So we need to see what the government want to do next year. I'm sure they won't want the very first LGR to happen in this phase to be a failure. And they do, I think, need to think about the financial sustainability over the next few years.
Yeah, and it's I suppose with everything that's going on nationally, chopping and changing of leadership or government is not welcome at the moment. And it also throws a doubt, I guess, on another issue, which is the element that the Surrey sees as a potential opportunity or solution to local government debt and also to the economic situation, which is devolution. You know, your side of Surrey essentially will become an economic powerhouse. You've got the knowledge, we're calling it the knowledge corridor, you know, through with the university, the largest employer in the county, I believe, and the economic generation there, who, you know, is a solution that the government devolves powers more so to the local areas, as we see in other countries like Spain. And how quickly should that be done?
So this whole process was supposed to enable effectively mayoral devolution and all the things that came with it. And I think there is definitely a secondary discussion that should be about, is Surrey a big enough economic unit and a type of economic unit that can sufficiently be a mayoralty on its own? And we're hearing from the government that actually that mayoralty may not now have an election until 2028, so a lot longer than we thought. But then I do agree there is the potential here. I mean, where you see theoretical economic powerhouses, and I completely agree with you, West Surrey on paper should exactly be that. But there are plenty of examples in economics going back to about the last 50 years where such theoretical powerhouses are limited by things like debt. And I do think the government are going to need to look at this, because it's no point saying West Surrey is great on paper, the growth should be fantastic, when it can't effectively leverage that powerhouse potential because it's held back by debt. They clearly want to unlock that capability, and it is there. It's absolutely there. I completely agree with you on that. But to unlock that, they are going to need to intervene again. I think people forget how many things local government touches, and it has a far bigger impact on an individual's personal life than central government does most of the time. And whether that be through waste collection and things that all residents use, highways, or whether it be more specific things like adults and children's services, SEN, that kind of thing. So they are impactful on people's lives. The bit that I would probably go to, as well as not being able to unlock the growth and potential of West Surrey, is also some of the assumptions the government make when they talk about local government finances. Because of a higher proportion of very wealthy people that there are in Surrey, there is an assumption that this money can somehow be generated from the local population, and that's how we get back to a debt-free Surrey. The problem with some of this is that local government tax bans, or a lot of the valuations for business rates and various other things like that are now so in dire need of reform that, again, it's well and good the government making assumptions based upon some of these metrics, but we can't actually access these funds. We can't change these things without genuine reform to local government structures. And without getting too political, we've gone from a government that didn't recognise any local government issues as being important at all to a government now who seem to recognise it, but are using policies that are at best a sledgehammer to crack a nut, or at worst, ineffective. Mansion tax, for example, is one of those things that looks like it might do something, but in practice is an incredibly unnuanced attempt at resolving local government finance issues, and it won't work. They won't put in the effort to do it properly. And my call to MHCLG, as it often is to hear local government, hear the sorts of things that we're saying. And it's not give us loads of bailout money. It's reform the systems so that we can at least make a good job of helping ourselves out of these issues.
You're listening to the LGR Podcast. Visit localgovernmentreorganisation.co.uk to learn more.
If Woking can get itself into this situation, how can a new West Surrey be trusted with devolution? And importantly, should not a new West Surrey, with its rich tax base, be supporting other parts of the country where there is higher levels of deprivation and lack of public services?
First of all, I would challenge the notion that there are units universally higher tax base in Surrey. It's quite variable across the patch. And actually, when you look at any individual ward, sometimes there is not just high areas of deprivation relative to the rest of Surrey. They are actually nationally ranked quite high up the league tables of deprivation. And often, I mean, I take part of Godalming, where I'm the town council leader as well. One of the poorest areas of Surrey looks over the hill at Charterhouse School, and one of the wealthiest areas. I mean, the deprivation gap in parts of Surrey is significant. There has also been lack of investment in parts of Surrey for years, and that won't just be fixed overnight, and that's everywhere. And of course, places like Woking, where they've been under commissioners now for a good few years and services have been cut down to an absolute skeleton, there are areas there where there's a huge unmet need. And actually, one of the things I'm concerned about for West Surrey is that the moment that becomes one contiguous territory, I mean, I'm not expecting the citizens' advice operation in Guildford and Waverley to start turning away people who come from Woking, but I think it's practical to think that it is likely that the demand that is there will find places where they can get help, and that's great. But we do need to figure out how that's going to work. At the moment, so much funding from business rates and from all sorts of things goes straight to central government, and this is where, without a fundamental review of some of the funding models that we use in this country for local government, this doesn't work. And that's why I'm actually disappointed that LGR is being done in this way, because it should have been done concurrently with local government funding reforms that make sense, instead of largely nothing, unfortunately. I mean, I did have some hope that the new government might take seriously the idea of reforming local government finance, and unfortunately they haven't. And my real concern is that West Surrey will be a replica of some of the problems that we've had before. Everything Woking did, and I agree, there were political decisions by a party that now doesn't run Woking, but everything they did was technically legal. And was it right? Absolutely not. And were they decisions I would have made? Absolutely not. They were gambling, as far as I'm concerned, with public money, which led to that debt. But unfortunately, nothing they were doing was illegal under the system at the time. And so a lot of these things need reform. And I would have really preferred LGR to happen after those reforms. That being said, we're going to have to make the best of it and try and make this work for residents in West Surrey. And that's a territory that will stretch from Hazelmere to Staines. And they're very different places with very different needs and issues. And we're going to have to try and balance those.
Yeah, and I took concern to theoretical slightly here, because you have the privilege of being on the committee that is forming the proposed constitution and scheme of delegations that will have to be adopted at the first meeting. So for those listening, there's a legal quirk which requires at the very first meeting of the new council for the new council to adopt a constitution and proper officers. It's a bit of a catch-22 because you can't have that meeting until those things are essentially in some kind of good states. Councillor Follows and others are a group of, it's 12, isn't it? It's 6 boroughs
it's
on
12,
your
yeah.
side. One from each of the boroughs and then 6 from the county. And whether or not you could argue that's stacked in favour of one party or the other, we'll come to in a moment. But as part of that, there's 2 questions. Number one, is it right that councillors from essentially the old guard, from an old system that, like Woking, that has failed, should they really be drafting this new constitution and these new schemes of delegation? And is it more appropriate that we wait until new councillors are elected and let them determine their future? Because otherwise, are we not baking in by appointing officers? My understanding is that the interim officer appointments will come from the existing boroughs. I might be wrong on that, but one time, are we not just baking in the same old problems at a higher level? This needs substantial governance and structural reviews. What would be the first couple of things that you would tackle in a council's new setup?
So, in a way, I do agree that it's probably not ideal that people, the old councillors, for lack of better words, are helping construct this new entity. I suppose in practice, that has to happen, and there's nobody else with any legal authority at present to do it. And all the current borough councils, county councils, etc., they're the ones with the legal authority now. I mean, the second part of that's a bit more technical in the sense that actually they're not making the decisions for the new unitary. The new unitary will have elected members, and they will make a decision as to whether to adopt those recommendations or not. And they have all the power they want to change them when the time comes. So it is only a recommendation from this joint committee to the new council. In terms of if I had all the power in the world to sort out all these things on day one, I mean, from my personal perspective, I've actually got to get elected to this new unitary. So I get a bit superstitious about such things, and I don't want to jump to that conclusion as read. But if I am elected to it, the things I would like to do are making sure that we have a fair and sound delegation and budget system within that new council. I think residents will need to see very quickly that the mistakes of the past in some of these Surrey boroughs will not be replicated in West Surrey. And I think the more important thing above all is to establish a really good officer and member culture in this new council, because actually some of the systems and cultures we have in the councils of Surrey at the moment are not great. I don't think some of these councils are places that people want to work in. And we need to bring it back to this public service duty that should run through local governments. It needs to be fair, it needs to be legal, and it needs to, I think, produce good results through that good culture. So I see this as an opportunity. Don't get me wrong, there are huge, huge issues with this council and its formation and the debts and all the rest of it. But on the other hand, this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to create something new, to actually establish a proper new vision for local government and what it can do for people. And I'm going to sound like a massive local government nerd when I say this. I actually find the prospect of creating a new council, new culture from scratch, I find that genuinely exciting.
Low, I think it's under 0.5% of the resident population. There's new ones that have been announced. Maybe word is starting to get out more, but there's a legitimacy point here overall that, the councils have to, cut through with the public. So my final question for you would be, how will you justify a new council with, say, a 20% turnout on a formation position?
In a way, there's the legal point, which is if it's elected, and it's got a duty to do that. I think what is always the case when it comes to local government, you have a duty to try and bring people with you as you go. And there will always be people who didn't vote, there will be people who didn't take part. I'm not going to assume what those people would have done or would have voted if they voted. I'm going to assume that they need to know more and they need to understand more. And so a large part of this new unitary, if it's anything to do with me, will be about engaging with residents, will be about actually bringing council business to the local level. Despite it being so huge, there are ways to bring it to the local level and to genuinely engage with the public. And it is my hope that however complicated this new unitary is, we will have engaged people properly over its first 5 years, and that the turnout in the second round of elections for it will be better as a result.
Well, I think that sounds like a commitment to public consultation, which I obviously fully support.
Absolutely.
So I thank you for your time, Councillor. I know you've got a train to catch as your speech. Thank you, and we'll continue talking to you as this progresses.